My 3 children didn't visit me once in 25 years after their mother died, would send occasional texts asking if I was still alive like I was a houseplant they'd forgotten about. They assumed I was a poor old farmer barely surviving on Social Security, not worth their time or the drive to visit. Then last month, a county notice went public showing something they never knew about my property. And within 3 days, my phone that hadn't rung in years started exploding. Turns out, my kids wanted reunion, but what I did next shocked them. Before that, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe so more people hear this story. After my wife Margaret died suddenly from a heart attack in 1998, my 3 children, who'd all been living within a few hours of the farm, attended her funeral and stayed for a week helping me sort through her belongings. They seemed concerned about me during that time, asked if I'd be okay living alone on the farm, offered to help me figure out my finances and daily routine without their mother. Told them I'd be fine and had been farming for 40 years, knew how to take care of myself and the property. Assured them they should go back to their own lives and families without worrying about me. My oldest son Daniel went back to his corporate job in the city 3 hours away, said he'd visit soon and we'd stay in close touch. My daughter Rebecca returned to her life as a high school teacher 2 states over, promised she'd come back for holidays and long weekends. My youngest son Thomas headed back to his law practice across the country, told me to call if I needed anything and he'd be there. All 3 of them seemed sincere about maintaining connection and making sure I wasn't alone in my grief. But the visits they'd promised never materialized after that first year. The close touch we'd stay in became occasional phone calls that grew further apart until they stopped completely. Started noticing around the 2nd year that they only called on my birthday and Christmas, conversations that lasted maybe 10 minutes before they'd make excuses about being busy and needing to go. By the 5th year, even those obligatory calls had stopped, replaced by text messages that felt like checking boxes on a list of responsibilities they resented. The texts were always brief and impersonal, just "Happy birthday, Dad," or "Hope you're doing well," with no real interest in my response or life. Sometimes they'd ask, "Do you need anything?" But the tone made it clear they were hoping I'd say no, that offering help was just a formality they didn't actually want me to accept. Never asked about my daily life or the farm or whether I was lonely, never invited me to visit them or meet the grandchildren they were having without including me. 25 years passed in crushing silence and isolation, my phone sitting on the kitchen counter going days or weeks without ringing, my mailbox containing only bills and junk mail with no cards or letters from my children. Lived completely alone in the small farmhouse where I'd raised them, ate every meal in silence at a table that used to be full of family, worked the land from dawn to dusk just to fill the empty hours. Aged invisibly while my children built lives and families in other places, became a grandfather to kids who didn't know I existed. Started to accept around year 10 that my children had essentially abandoned me, had decided their elderly father living on a farm wasn't worth maintaining a relationship with. Told myself they were busy with their own lives and careers and families, that the distance made visiting difficult, that I shouldn't take it personally when they forgot my birthday or didn't respond to my occasional attempts to reach out. But the loneliness was crushing, waking up every day knowing nobody cared whether I was alive or dead. Watched neighbors who had children receive regular visits and phone calls, saw other elderly farmers being helped by sons and daughters who cared about their aging parents. Felt the sting of comparison when I'd see families together at church or town events. Felt invisible when people would ask about my children and I'd have to make excuses about how busy they were. The shame of being an abandoned parent was almost as painful as the loneliness itself. My children had scattered across the country pursuing their careers and building their families, creating lives that had no space for their father who'd worked himself to exhaustion raising them on the farm. They sent their kids to private schools and took expensive vacations, posted photos on social media of their comfortable lives, never mentioned or included the grandfather who'd given them the foundation for their success. Became a forgotten relic from their past, someone they'd rather not think about because acknowledging me meant acknowledging their neglect. Spent holidays alone every year for 2.5 decades, ate Christmas dinner by myself, celebrated my birthday without calls or cards, marked the anniversary of Margaret's death with nobody to share the grief. The silence became normal after so many years, learned to expect nothing and feel nothing when special occasions passed unacknowledged. My children had convinced themselves over the years that I was barely surviving financially, that I was a poor old farmer struggling to get by on whatever meager Social Security checks I received each month. The assumption was based on surface appearances they'd seen during their rare contacts, the fact that I lived in the same old farmhouse I'd owned since the 1970s that needed paint and repairs I never bothered with, drove a 1985 pickup truck that was rusted and dented but still ran fine, wore work clothes that were more patches than original fabric because I saw no reason to buy new ones when these still functioned. The few times we'd communicated over the years through texts or brief phone calls, they'd always ask in a patronizing tone if I needed money or financial help. The question was never genuine concern about my welfare, but rather a way of confirming their assumption that I was poor and probably struggling. Could tell from their tone they were hoping I'd say no because they didn't actually want to send me money, were just performing the ritual of asking so they could feel like good children who offered assistance. Never corrected their assumption about my finances because I didn't need their money or their pity, didn't want anything from children who'd abandoned me except maybe acknowledgement that I existed. Let them believe whatever they wanted about my financial situation. Figured it didn't matter what they thought since they weren't part of my life anyway. Their assumption that I was poor seemed to justify their neglect in their minds, like a struggling old farmer wasn't worth visiting because what could he offer them or their families? Daniel would occasionally mention in his brief texts that he was doing well financially, that his corporate job was lucrative and his family lived comfortably in the suburbs. Never asked about my situation except those perfunctory questions about needing money seemed to assume that because I was a farmer, I must be poor compared to his white-collar success. The class condescension was subtle but clear. He'd moved up in the world, and I'd stayed behind on the farm. Rebecca would post on social media about her teacher salary and how hard it was to make ends meet on what schools paid, used her financial struggles as excuse for why she couldn't afford to visit or help her elderly father. Yet somehow she managed vacations to beach resorts and regularly updated photos of her nicely furnished home. Her priorities clearly didn't include her father. Never occurred to her to ask if I actually needed help or to consider that maybe I was more financially stable than she assumed. Thomas, with his law practice, would occasionally send me small checks for holidays, with notes about hoping this helped me out. The amounts were insulting considering his income level. But more insulting was the assumption I needed his charity. Would send $50 or $100 like he was being generous to his poor farmer father, never asking if I actually needed money or what my financial situation really was. The checks felt like guilt offerings meant to ease his conscience about never visiting rather than genuine concern about my welfare. Their texts asking if I needed money always had the same underlying message, that they viewed me as a burden who might become their financial responsibility if my situation got bad enough. Were checking to make sure I wasn't about to ask them for support, wanted confirmation I was still self-sufficient enough that they didn't need to worry. Never once considered that maybe the poor old farmer they'd written off might actually be doing fine financially. The assumption that I was barely surviving served their narrative perfectly, let them justify their absence and neglect by telling themselves their father was just a poor farmer with nothing to offer them or their children. Wasn't worth the drive to visit because what would be the point of maintaining relationship with someone who had no resources or connections or anything valuable to contribute to their lives? They'd calculated my worth based on what they thought I had and decided I wasn't worth their time. My worn clothes and old truck and modest lifestyle fit perfectly into their story about why they'd stayed away. They could tell themselves and others that their father preferred his simple life and probably didn't want visitors anyway. Never occurred to them that maybe I lived simply by choice rather than necessity. That frugality and humility weren't the same as poverty. What my 3 children never knew, because I'd never told anyone outside my attorney and accountant, was that over 50 years of careful farming and strategic planning, I'd been quietly acquiring adjacent properties as neighboring farmers retired or passed away. Started in 1970 with the 15 acres where our farmhouse sat. Land I'd purchased with savings from working factory jobs before transitioning to full-time farming. Worked that initial land hard and smart, saved every extra dollar from crop sales instead of spending on luxuries or upgrades to the house. When my neighbor Earl Johnson decided to retire in 1978 and move to Florida, I bought his 5 acres that bordered my property on the west side. Paid cash from savings I'd been accumulating specifically for land acquisition, saw real estate as the best investment a farmer could make. 3 years later, another neighbor passed away, and his widow didn't want to maintain the farm. Sold me 10 acres at a fair price because she knew I'd keep the land agricultural instead of selling to developers. Continued this patient strategy for decades, watching the real estate listings and keeping relationships with neighboring farmers, positioning myself to buy whenever properties came available. Added 20 acres here when the Miller farm went up for sale in 1989, another 15 acres there when the Peterson family consolidated their holdings in 1995. Never took out loans or mortgages, always paid cash from farming profits I'd carefully saved and invested. Kept my acquisitions quiet because I didn't believe in bragging about success. By the mid-2000s, I owned nearly 80 acres of contiguous land, all of it prime agricultural property with good soil and water access. The city had been expanding slowly in our direction for years, development pressure driving up land values as suburban sprawl consumed former farmland. Real estate agents would occasionally contact me, asking if I was interested in selling. Developers offering premium prices for land they wanted to convert to housing subdivisions. Always said no because I was still farming and intended to keep the land agricultural as long as I was alive. Acquired my final major parcel in 2015 when the Harrison family farm of 40 acres came on the market after the last surviving Harrison died without heirs. The property had been tied up in estate proceedings for 2 years, finally released for sale at auction where I was the highest bidder. That purchase brought my total holdings to 120 contiguous acres, one of the largest single-owner agricultural parcels left in the county. The land had appreciated enormously over the decades from what I'd paid, recent appraisals putting the total value around $4.8 million. Never told my children about the land acquisitions because they'd never asked about my life or shown interest in the farm, figured it was none of their business what I did with my money or property. They'd assumed I was poor and struggling, so I let them believe it, saw no reason to correct their ignorance when they couldn't be bothered to maintain basic relationship with me. The land was my business and my legacy to decide what to do with, not something I owed them information about. Kept detailed records of every purchase and maintained clear titles on all parcels, worked with my attorney to ensure everything was properly documented and legally sound. Had a will that originally left everything to my 3 children equally, figured that was the fair and traditional thing for a parent to do. But over the 25 years of their silence and neglect, started questioning whether children who'd abandoned their father deserved to inherit the fruits of his lifetime of work. The land represented 50 years of careful planning, hard physical labor, strategic thinking, and disciplined saving. Every acre had been earned through sweat and sacrifice, through decades of farming dawn to dusk and living frugally so I could invest in property. My children had contributed nothing to this success, hadn't even known it existed, had written me off as a poor, irrelevant old man while I quietly built an estate worth millions. They'd measured my worth by their assumptions about my poverty and decided I wasn't valuable enough to maintain relationship with, never imagining their poor farmer father actually owned prime real estate that would make them millionaires if he died. Last month in October, I received an official notice in the mail from the county planning department about a proposed highway expansion project that would affect landowners in our rural area. The state transportation department was planning to build a new connector highway that would link the interstate to the growing suburbs, a major infrastructure project that had been in planning stages for years. The notice explained that the highway route would require purchasing land from multiple property owners through eminent domain, that affected landowners would be contacted about compensation and acquisition procedures. The notice included a detailed map showing the proposed highway route and a list of all properties that would be impacted by the project, properties organized by size and owner name for public record purposes. My property was listed prominently because at 120 contiguous acres, it was one of the largest parcels affected by the planned route. The listing showed clearly, Richardson, Harold, 120 acres, Primary agricultural use. Estimated acquisition value range $3.5 to $5.2 million, depending on final route determination. The county had posted the entire notice, including the landowner list and map, on their public website for transparency purposes, made it available for anyone to view as part of the public comment period for the highway project. Local newspapers picked up the story because infrastructure projects always generated interest, ran articles about the highway expansion, and included details about major landowners who'd be affected. My name appeared in the local paper with the headline, "Highway Project to Impact County's Largest Agricultural Properties," listing me as owner of 120 acres worth millions. The news spread quickly through our small rural community, where everyone knew everyone's business. Neighbors who'd known me for decades suddenly looked at me differently, realizing the quiet farmer down the road actually owned significant valuable property. People started commenting on social media and community forums about being surprised the old Richardson farm was actually so large. Most people had assumed I only owned the 15 acres where my house sat. The revelation that I'd been quietly accumulating land for 50 years made me something of a local curiosity. The county website listing was public record that anyone could access with an internet search. The newspaper articles were available online. Suddenly, information about my property holdings was easily discoverable by anyone who bothered to look. Real estate speculators started calling, asking about my plans for the land, whether I'd be willing to sell to them instead of waiting for the county acquisition. Financial advisors contacted me, suggesting ways to maximize the value of my holdings. Everyone suddenly very interested in the wealthy farmer they'd been ignoring. The public exposure of my land ownership and its value was completely beyond my control, happened through routine government transparency processes that I couldn't have prevented even if I'd wanted to. Had lived quietly for decades, keeping my business private, suddenly found my financial situation plastered across county records and local news for everyone, including my children, to discover. The privacy and anonymity I'd maintained about my wealth disappeared overnight through circumstances I hadn't anticipated. Several people in town who knew my children mentioned seeing the news and assumed they must be excited about their father's valuable property. Asked me if my kids were coming to visit now that the highway project might bring significant money. Told them politely my children and I weren't in close contact. Changed the subject because I didn't want to admit to neighbors that my own kids had abandoned me for 25 years. The questions made me realize that my children would inevitably hear about the land through the same public channels everyone else had. The notice from the county had been sent in early October. The newspaper articles ran within a week. The information was readily available online by mid-October for anyone who might search my name or browse local news. Sat in my kitchen looking at the public records listing my property and its value. Knew it was only a matter of time before Daniel and Rebecca and Thomas discovered their poor farmer father actually owned land worth nearly $5 million. Wondered if they'd finally break their 25 years of silence once they learned I had money worth inheriting. My phone started ringing on a Thursday morning, exactly 3 days after the county notice and newspaper articles had been published online, the sudden noise startling me because the phone hadn't rung in months except for spam calls I never answered. Looked at the caller ID and saw it was Daniel, my oldest son, who I hadn't heard from in over a year, hadn't received even a birthday text from in the past 2 years. My heart jumped with unexpected hope that maybe he was calling to genuinely check on me. Picked up the phone with cautious optimism. Daniel's voice was warm and enthusiastic in a way I hadn't heard in decades, started talking immediately about how he'd been thinking about me and realized it had been way too long since we'd connected properly. Said he'd been meaning to visit for years, but work and family obligations had kept getting in the way. Claimed he felt terrible about the time that had passed without seeing me. Then he got to his real point. Said he was planning to drive up that very weekend to spend time with me. Wanted to help me with anything I needed around the farm. Before I could process Daniel's sudden interest in visiting, my phone buzzed with incoming calls from both Rebecca and Thomas within the next hour. Rebecca left a voicemail saying she'd seen some news about county development projects and was worried developers might try to take advantage of me, wanted to come discuss my situation and make sure I was protected. Thomas sent a text followed immediately by a call, his lawyer voice explaining he was concerned about my legal position regarding the highway project and wanted to help me navigate the process. Within 24 hours, all three of my children, who hadn't visited once in 25 years, were suddenly making concrete plans to converge on my farm that coming weekend. Daniel confirmed he'd drive up Friday evening and stay through Sunday. Rebecca booked a flight arriving Saturday morning. Thomas arranged to fly in Saturday afternoon. They were all suddenly available despite the busy lives and obligations that had kept them away for a quarter century. Suddenly, their elderly father was worth their time and travel expenses. The transparent timing of their sudden interest was almost insulting in how obvious it was. They'd all clearly seen the public records showing my land holdings and calculated I was worth paying attention to now that money was involved. Not one of them mentioned the 25 years of silence or acknowledged how strange it was that they were all visiting simultaneously after decades of absence. They talked about their plans like this was normal family behavior, like they visited regularly, and this was just another get-together. Rebecca sent me a text Friday evening saying she was so excited to finally bring her family to visit, mentioned her husband and two teenagers who I'd never met would be coming with her. Thomas replied to a group text saying his wife and their three young children were also coming, said the kids had been asking about their grandfather and it was time they finally met me. Daniel confirmed his wife and their two kids would be with him. Suddenly 13 people I'd either never met or hadn't seen in decades were planning to descend on my small farmhouse. The family reunion they were planning felt completely manufactured and performative, timed perfectly to coincide with public revelation of my wealth rather than any genuine desire for relationship. They were bringing their families, not because they'd been wanting to connect me with my grandchildren, but because they wanted to establish family presence and stake claims to the inheritance they'd just discovered existed. The sudden flood of communication after years of silence was more insulting than if they'd stayed away. Spent that week before their planned visit feeling a mixture of emotions, part of me desperately wanting to believe maybe they'd genuinely realized their mistake in abandoning me and wanted to rebuild relationship. But the cynical part that had developed over 25 years of loneliness knew exactly why they were coming. Knew the public record showing my millions in land value had triggered their interest rather than any actual love or concern for their father. Prepared myself for a weekend of fake warmth and transparent attempts to influence my estate planning. That Saturday, my quiet farmhouse that had been silent for 25 years suddenly filled with noise and activity as all three of my children arrived with their families. 13 people total cramming into the small spaces that had been designed for a family of 5 decades ago. Daniel arrived first with his wife Christine and their two teenage children I'd seen only in occasional social media posts. They pulled up in an expensive SUV and came rushing toward me with arms open for hugs. The physical embrace felt strange and uncomfortable after so many years without contact. His warmth felt manufactured and rehearsed rather than genuine. Rebecca showed up an hour later with her husband Mark and their two kids, who stared at me like I was a stranger because that's exactly what I was to them, had never been part of their lives in any meaningful way. She hugged me tightly and kept saying how wonderful it was to finally be home. Called the farm home, even though she'd left it 30 years ago and never looked back. Thomas arrived last with his wife Sarah and their 3 young children, the little ones hiding behind their parents' legs, shy around the grandfather they'd never met. They all made a huge production of taking photos with me for their social media accounts, posed me in various spots around the farm with different combinations of family members surrounding me. Could hear them talking about getting good shots to post online, discussing which angles and lighting made the best pictures, treating me like a prop in their performance of being a devoted family. Rebecca posted several photos immediately with captions about precious time with Dad and family reunions, comments from her friends expressing surprise that she had a father since she'd never mentioned me before. The grandchildren were instructed to call me Grandpa and give me hugs, these kids ranging from age 4 to 17 who'd never heard my name before. This weekend suddenly expected to perform affection for a stranger. The older ones looked uncomfortable and confused about why they were meeting their grandfather for the first time. The younger ones were just following instructions from parents without understanding the situation. Felt like a stranger receiving forced affection from people who owed me nothing because their parents had never built any relationship between us. Every conversation somehow steered toward my land and the highway project. No matter how much I tried to redirect to other topics, they'd ask casual-sounding questions that were clearly probing for information about my plans and estate situation. Daniel would mention he'd been reading about the highway project and wondered what my strategy was for dealing with it, whether I'd hired representation or talked to financial advisors. Rebecca kept bringing up estate planning and asking if I had everything organized properly for tax purposes. Thomas, with his legal background, was the most direct, started talking about protecting assets and ensuring proper wealth transfer, threw around terms like family trusts and limited liability companies, would frame his questions as concern for my welfare and protecting me from being taken advantage of, but the real message was clear that he wanted to know how my wealth would be divided and wanted to influence that division. His lawyer training made him better at disguising his motives, but the underlying agenda was identical to his siblings. They talked about family legacy and keeping the land in the Richardson name for future generations, painting themselves as stewards of something they'd never contributed to or cared about until they discovered its value. Made plans for future visits and family gatherings as if this weekend was the beginning of renewed closeness rather than a transparent money grab. Discussed how the grandchildren should spend summers on the farm, learning about their heritage they'd been deliberately excluded from for their entire lives because their parents couldn't be bothered to maintain relationship with me. The false warmth and manufactured devotion was almost harder to bear than the years of silence had been. At least the abandonment had been honest about their lack of interest in me. This performance of love and concern was insulting in how transparent it was. How little effort they put into disguising that money rather than relationship had motivated their sudden appearance. Watched them play happy family while calculating inheritance shares. Felt like a wallet with legs rather than a father or grandfather these people actually cared about. Sunday morning, I woke up to the smell of someone cooking breakfast in my kitchen, found Rebecca and Christine working together to prepare a big family meal. Like this was normal, and they'd done it 100 times before. They were laughing and talking about family recipes and memories of cooking with Margaret, performing domesticity and connection to a home they'd abandoned decades ago. Sat at my own table feeling like a guest in my house, while these women who'd never cooked me a meal in 25 years suddenly played devoted daughters and daughters-in-law. Thomas came down the stairs with his laptop already open, started talking about wanting to discuss some important matters while we had the whole family together this weekend. Daniel joined in, saying this was a perfect opportunity to make sure everything was organized properly with my affairs, that they'd been worried about me managing such valuable assets alone at my age. The coordination between them was obvious. They'd clearly discussed their approach before arriving and had planned this intervention. Then Daniel dropped the real surprise, said he'd taken the liberty of inviting his personal attorney to join us for breakfast to discuss estate planning options. Said the lawyer was a family friend who'd generously agreed to drive out on a Sunday morning to help us, framed it like he'd done me a huge favor by arranging professional help I hadn't asked for. About 20 minutes later, a man in expensive casual clothes arrived carrying a leather briefcase, introduced himself as Martin Whitmore from a prestigious law firm in the city. Martin made himself comfortable at my kitchen table like he'd been invited, pulled documents and folders from his briefcase while Rebecca served him coffee and breakfast. Started talking about how Daniel had briefed him on my situation with the land and the highway project, said he'd prepared some options for structuring my assets to protect them from taxes and ensure proper family legacy planning. The presentation was smooth and professional, clearly rehearsed and designed to sound like helpful advice rather than what it really was. He spread papers across my table showing proposed structures for family limited liability companies and irrevocable trusts, used terms like wealth preservation and multi-generational planning to make it sound sophisticated and necessary. The documents were already partially completed with my name and property descriptions filled in, just needed my signature to transfer my land into a family LLC that would be managed by my 3 children. Martin explained this would protect the assets from estate taxes and ensure the land stayed in family control. Watched my 3 children nodding along with Martin's presentation like this was all perfectly reasonable and in my best interest. They'd rehearsed their roles in this performance and were executing it smoothly. Daniel emphasized how this would simplify things for me and take the burden of property management off my shoulders at my age. Rebecca talked about ensuring the family legacy stayed together for future generations. Thomas used his lawyer knowledge to second everything Martin said, lending professional credibility to the pitch. The real translation of their proposal was obvious, despite the sophisticated legal language. They wanted me to sign over control of my $4.8 million in property to them while I was still alive. The family LLC would be managed by a board consisting of my 3 children who'd make all decisions about the land, including whether and when to sell. I'd retain nominal ownership on paper, but they'd have practical control, could liquidate the property and divide the proceeds among themselves whenever they wanted. Martin pulled out signature pages and a notary stamp, said he'd brought everything needed to execute the documents right now if I was ready to move forward. Explained the process would take just a few minutes to sign and notarize, framed it like a simple administrative task rather than signing away control of everything I'd worked 50 years to build. My 3 children sat there watching me expectantly, waiting for me to pick up the pen and give them what they'd driven all this way to get. The level of planning and coordination this had required was stunning. They'd arranged the lawyer and prepared the documents and rehearsed their pitch all before arriving at my farm. Had spent their weekend visit performing love and family connections specifically to set up this moment where they'd pressure me to transfer my wealth to them. The manipulation was sophisticated but transparent. I let them finish their entire presentation while I sat quietly at my kitchen table, watched Martin lay out all his papers and documents with signature lines highlighted, listened to my 3 children enthusiastically endorse the plan he'd described, didn't interrupt or ask questions, just let them complete their rehearsed performance, thinking I was a confused old man who'd be easily manipulated by professional legal presentation and family pressure. They mistook my silence for consideration or agreement, their faces showing confidence that their plan was working perfectly. When Martin finally finished talking and slid the signature pages toward me with a pen, I let the silence stretch for a long moment while all of them watched me expectantly. Could see the anticipation in their eyes, the barely concealed eagerness for me to sign documents that would transfer control of my life's work to them. Then I reached into my own folder that I'd placed on the table earlier, pulled out documents I'd had my attorney prepare the previous week after receiving the county notice. Told them I appreciated Martin taking time on a Sunday morning to drive all the way out here, but I'd already met with my own attorney last week and updated my estate plan. Watched their confident expressions start to falter as I explained I'd been doing some thinking about how to handle my assets given the highway project and my advancing age. Spread my own legal documents across the table, pushed Martin's unsigned papers back toward him, told them they'd find my plan quite different from what they'd proposed. Read directly from the updated will my attorney had prepared, explained that upon my death, the entire 120 acres of land would be sold at fair market value, with proceeds distributed according to my instructions. My 3 children sat up straighter, their faces showing relief that I was planning to sell and distribute money, probably calculating that $4.8 million divided 3 ways would give them each over $1.5 million. Their relief was premature. Continued reading that all proceeds from the sale would go entirely to agricultural preservation charities that protect farmland from development, and to scholarship funds that help rural students from farming families attend college. Watched my children's faces transform from relief to confusion to dawning horror as they processed that they weren't mentioned as beneficiaries. Specified that organizations like the American Farmland Trust and the Future Farmers of America would receive the bulk of my estate. Students from farming backgrounds would get educational opportunities I wanted to provide. The room went completely silent as the implication sank in, nobody moving or speaking while they absorbed that I was intentionally disinheriting all 3 of them. Daniel was the first to react, started sputtering about how this didn't make sense, and asking what they'd done to deserve being cut out. Rebecca's face went red, and her eyes filled with angry tears. Thomas just stared at the documents like he couldn't process what he was reading. Explained calmly that I'd thought carefully about who deserved to benefit from 50 years of my hard work and sacrifice, who had earned the right to inherit what I'd built through dedication and strategic planning. Told them I'd decided that people who actually cared about preserving agricultural heritage and supporting rural communities deserved my legacy more than children who'd spent 25 years ignoring my existence. The charities would use my money to protect farmland like mine from being turned into suburban developments. The scholarships would help kids who actually valued farming and rural life. Martin tried to interject with legal language about contesting wills and undue influence, suggested I might not be thinking clearly and should reconsider. Told him my attorney had confirmed I was completely competent and within my rights to leave my property to anyone I chose, that the will had been properly executed with witnesses and couldn't be easily contested. My mental capacity had been formally evaluated and documented specifically to prevent challenges from disappointed heirs. Watched the masks of false affection and concern fall away from my children's faces. Saw naked rage and greed replace the warmth they'd been performing all weekend. They'd spent 2 days pretending to love me, brought their families to pose for photos, rehearsed concern about my welfare, all building toward this moment where they'd expected to secure their inheritance. Stood up from my kitchen table and looked at my 3 children who were still sitting in shock processing that they'd been disinherited, their faces showing emotions they'd been hiding behind false warmth all weekend. Told them I had some things I needed to say that I'd been holding inside for 25 years. Things they needed to hear before they left my property and my life for what would likely be the final time. The room stayed silent, even the grandchildren sensing the tension and sitting frozen in their chairs. Started by reminding them it had been 25 years since their mother died. 25 years since they'd promised to visit soon and stay in close touch with their grieving father. Counted out loud that 25 years meant 300 months, over 9,000 days, all of which I'd lived alone in this house eating meals in silence and aging invisibly while they built lives elsewhere. Not one visit in all that time, not one holiday spent together, not one birthday phone call in recent years, just occasional texts asking if I needed money that made it clear they hoped I'd say no. Told them I'd spent those 25 years being a grandfather to children I'd never met, watching other families gather for holidays while I sat alone, making excuses at church when people asked about my kids because admitting the truth that they'd abandoned me was too humiliating. Described how I'd kept their photos on my walls and told myself they were just busy. Convinced myself for years that the distance wasn't personal rejection, but just the reality of modern families spread across the country. But eventually, I'd stopped making excuses and accepted they simply didn't care if I was alive or dead. Pointed out that they'd all assumed I was a poor old farmer barely surviving on Social Security. Their texts asking if I needed money revealed they thought I was struggling financially. Told them that assumption had apparently justified their absence in their minds, that a poor farmer with nothing to offer wasn't worth maintaining relationship with or introducing to their children. They'd measured my worth in dollars and decided I wasn't valuable enough to include in their lives, calculated I had nothing useful to contribute to their success or their children's futures. Explained that until 3 days ago my phone had been silent for months until public records revealed I owned 120 acres worth nearly $5 million. Suddenly, that same phone started ringing constantly. Suddenly, all 3 of them could find time in their busy schedules to visit. Suddenly, they were devoted family who'd brought lawyers and documents to help manage my estate. The timing wasn't coincidental. They'd discovered I had money and immediately came to secure their inheritance before I died or did something else with it. Told them directly that they'd spent this entire weekend performing love and concern they didn't actually feel. Brought their families to pose for photos that would document their renewed devotion to their father. Every conversation had been calculated to steer toward estate planning. Every expression of care had been designed to manipulate me into signing over control of my assets. They'd brought Martin with pre-prepared documents expecting I'd be confused enough or flattered enough by their attention to just sign whatever they put in front of me. Said I'd rather give every single acre to complete strangers who shared my values about agriculture and education than reward children who measured my worth in dollars and only loved their inheritance. Organizations that fought to preserve farmland would honor the work I'd done for 50 years better than children who'd never asked about my life or my farm. Rural students who valued education and hard work deserved help more than grandchildren who'd been deliberately kept from knowing me because their parents decided I wasn't worth their time. Watch them try to argue and make excuses, Daniel claiming he hadn't known how I felt and would have visited if I'd asked. Rebecca saying she'd been waiting for me to reach out first. Thomas insisting they'd all been planning to reconnect soon anyway. Told them their excuses didn't matter anymore, that I'd made my decision about my legacy and it didn't include them. Called the county sheriff, who I'd contacted earlier that morning, had them escorted off my property when they refused to leave on their own. My 3 children left that Sunday afternoon, escorted by sheriff's deputies after they'd refused my requests to leave peacefully, watched them pack their expensive vehicles with their families who'd driven all this way for nothing. Daniel tried one last time to argue with me from his car window, said I was being unreasonable and unfair, claimed he'd contest the will and fight my decision in court. Told him my attorney had anticipated that response and made sure the will was legally ironclad, that he'd waste whatever money he had left after years of comfortable living on legal fees that wouldn't change the outcome. Rebecca was crying and making her children cry by telling them their grandfather was being cruel and taking away their inheritance, using her kids as emotional leverage in one final attempt to manipulate me. Told her through the car window that her children had never been my grandchildren in any meaningful way because she'd kept them from me deliberately, that strangers couldn't inherit from a grandfather they'd never known. Thomas just looked defeated and angry, his lawyer mind probably already calculating the slim chances of successfully contesting a properly executed will from a competent testator. Haven't heard from any of them since that day 3 weeks ago. The sudden flood of calls and texts and family warmth evaporated the moment they learned the money was going to charities instead of them. My phone returned to its normal silence. No more enthusiastic messages about visiting soon or wanting to help with the farm. No more photos of family gatherings I suddenly wasn't invited to anymore. The fake love had an expiration date that coincided exactly with their discovery that inheritance wasn't coming. Still live alone on my 120 acres, still eat meals in silence at the same kitchen table where I confronted them with the truth about their abandoned father. The loneliness is the same as it's been for 25 years. Nothing changed about my daily life, except now I sleep peacefully, knowing I made the right decision about my legacy. Wake up every morning without regret about disinheriting children who never treated me like a father worth knowing. Feel satisfaction that my life's work will fund causes that actually matter. The highway project is moving forward, and the county has made an initial offer to purchase the portion of my land needed for the right-of-way. The compensation is generous and will provide more than enough for my remaining years. My attorney is negotiating the final terms, but the sale will likely close next year, leaving me with several $1 million to live comfortably and eventually donate, according to my wishes. The land I spent 50 years accumulating will partially be converted to infrastructure and partially be sold to conservation organizations who will keep it agricultural. Local people who know my children's story have quietly told me they support my decision. Other elderly parents who've experienced similar abandonment understand why I chose charities over ungrateful kids. The farmer community respects that I'm using my success to preserve agricultural land and help rural students, values that actually mean something to people who work the land. My attorney tells me the scholarship fund will help dozens of farming kids attend college over the coming decades, creating legacy that matters more than enriching 3 people who didn't earn it. My children probably tell their friends and their own kids that their father was cruel and vindictive, that I unfairly punished them for being busy with their own lives by cutting them from my will. They'll rewrite history to make themselves victims of an unreasonable old man, rather than acknowledge 25 years of deliberate neglect and abandonment. The story they tell themselves will justify their behavior and blame me for the consequences of their choices. But I know the truth about what happened. Know they never visited for 25 years until public records revealed I owned land worth millions. Know their sudden devotion lasted exactly as long as they thought inheritance was coming. They wanted my money without ever wanting their father, calculated my worth in dollars, and found me valuable only when the number was high enough. Some things like dignity and self-respect are worth more than $4.8 million, worth more than buying love from children who never deserved what I built. Those things can't be inherited by people who abandoned me for a quarter century and only came back when they smelled money.